There are moments in history that don't require gunfire or battlefields, yet they make the whole world fall silent. A single room, a microphone, and words spoken with conviction, powerful enough to shake the strongest walls of global power. Picture Geneva. Polished shoes echo against marble floors. World leaders whisper in languages that never make it to the cameras. The air feels heavy with diplomacy, thick with anticipation. And then, in the middle of this sea of expensive suits, a young man stands. No medals, no grand entourage, only steady eyes and a voice that refuses to waver. That man is Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, a country many in the West might struggle to find on a map. But in that moment, he wasn't speaking only for his nation. He was speaking for an entire continent, one that had endured centuries of exploitation and silence. This video will take you through that journey, how a voice rising in Geneva became the spark for a confrontation between morality and legality, justice and profit. And more importantly, it leaves us with a question that demands reflection. Whether you're in Washington, Paris, or New York, if the law protects contracts but not people, can it truly be called justice? Geneva, Switzerland. A chilly autumn morning, rain tapping gently against the towering glass windows of the International Convention Center. Inside, warm lights spilled across marble corridors as hundreds of diplomats from 150 nations made their way toward the main chamber. The echo of polished shoes blended with hushed conversations, low enough to avoid the cameras, but heavy enough that anyone passing by could feel the pressure in the air. Interpreters tested their headsets one last time. Camera crews adjusted their lenses. Everyone knew this was no ordinary meeting. At one corner of the room, a small placard rested before a microphone, printed in 4 languages. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. Among a sea of tailored suits, the young man in military fatigues stood out. Not polished, but commanding every glance in the chamber. They say international politics is a chessboard, where smaller nations are treated like pawns. But in this moment, Geneva felt less like a game and more like a stage. And here, a young leader from West Africa was about to step forward, carrying a question powerful enough to shake the order of global power. Can a single voice force the world to listen? Sitting in the section reserved for the African Union, Ibrahim Traoré looked like an outlier in Geneva's carefully choreographed stage. Around him, diplomats in tailored suits adjusted their ties, polished shoes gleaming under the lights. He, by contrast, wore his faded military fatigues, boots scuffed from the red soil of his homeland, and calloused hands that told stories of years in the field. Among this sea of elegance, he was both out of place and impossible to ignore. In front of him stood the polished wooden podium carved with the United Nations emblem, that familiar symbol of peace and order. For many African leaders before him, this emblem had meant hope. Yet for Traoré, it carried a bitter reminder. How many times had Africa sat in rooms like this, listening to promises of aid, development, and partnership, only to walk away with nothing but debt, exploitative contracts, and a future still chained to poverty? For him, Geneva was not simply a diplomatic gathering. It was a battlefield, one where he carried both the past and the future of Burkina Faso. His country, landlocked, isolated in West Africa, had been plundered for over a century. The French had arrived in the 19th century, planted their flag, and set the rules. Gold was extracted and shipped to Paris. Cotton fields yielded fabric for Europe's luxury markets. Yet back home, children still walked barefoot. Women trekked miles for clean water, and families survived on crumbs left from their own labor. Even the money in their pockets was not their own. The CFA franc, printed and controlled in France, served as an invisible shackle around Burkina Faso's economy. Every banknote they held was not proof of independence, but a reminder of dependence. That morning, in his breast pocket, Traoré did not carry a speech polished by advisors. Instead, he carried folded letters written by the hands of farmers, mothers, and miners. Letters stained with sweat and tears. One told of ancestral land sold off to foreign corporations. Another from a mother whose teenage son worked 12-hour days in a gold mine. His hands blistered, his wages barely enough to feed his siblings. These were not diplomatic words. They were cries for dignity. They were the true weight he carried into Geneva, not talking points, but the voices of his people. At 35, he was the youngest head of state in the room, but youth was not his weakness. It was his strength. He embodied a generation of Africans unwilling to bow, unwilling to wait for miracles from the very powers that had once treated them as subjects. A generation that believed silence was no longer survival, but surrender. Traoré knew the risks. He had watched comrades fall in battles against insurgents along Burkina Faso's northern frontier. He knew the cost of defiance. And now, here in Geneva, he understood another truth. Words could be as dangerous as bullets. One wrong phrase could mean aid cut off, isolation, or worse. But silence could be deadlier still. It would mean betraying the millions who had placed their last hope in him. In that moment, as he pressed those letters close to his chest, Geneva faded. It became Ouagadougou, the dusty capital where motorcycles weave through crumbling roads. It became the distant villages where mothers carry water on their heads for miles. It became the suffocating mines where children see more of the darkness underground than the sunlight above. He lifted his eyes and scanned the room, cold stares, curious glances, skeptical smirks. Yet in that instant, he was not just Ibrahim Traoré. He was the voice of a continent that had endured centuries of plunder, humiliation, and enforced silence. The question was no longer whether he had the courage to speak. The real question was, did the world have the courage to listen? 3 rows ahead of Traoré sat a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. His neatly combed gray hair caught the light. His steel-rimmed glasses glinted beneath the chandeliers. This was Edward Chen, a name well known in international legal circles, a U.S. judge famed for his razor-sharp reasoning and uncompromising standards. If Traoré entered the chamber as a soldier carrying the weight of history, Chen was the embodiment of Western legal power, cold, precise, and seemingly untouchable. Chen's story did not begin in privilege. It began in a cramped apartment in Oakland, California, where his parents, immigrants from Taiwan, worked double shifts to keep food on the table. His father had once been a judge himself, but fled political persecution, bringing with him little more than a handful of worn legal texts and an unshakable belief in justice. Young Edward spent his evenings translating those texts at the kitchen table while his mother cooked dinner. Those nights forged him into something more than a curious child. They forged the mind of a future jurist. By the age of 12, Edward could recite U.S. constitutional amendments, grasping nuances most law students struggle with. Harvard Law School quickly recognized his brilliance, but what set him apart wasn't just intellect. It was his instinct for exposing the moral flaws hidden within polished legal arguments. While classmates chased high-paying jobs at elite firms, Chen chose a small legal aid clinic, defending immigrants facing deportation. He knew the easy road, but he chose the harder one, the pursuit of fairness. That choice defined his career. By 32, he became one of the youngest federal judges in the country, confirmed with rare bipartisan support. In San Francisco courtrooms, he earned a reputation as the first to arrive, the last to leave, his desk buried beneath color-coded case files. His rulings stretched for hundreds of pages, dissecting every argument with surgical detail. Corporate giants and government agencies alike had reason to fear him, for he dismantled power with nothing more than the weight of constitutional logic. In academia, his opinions became case studies. In law schools across 3 continents, his reasoning was cited as the gold standard. Young judges sought his mentorship, believing that guidance from Chen was not just career-defining, but morally grounding. To his colleagues, he was a man who had transformed the courtroom into his cathedral. And now, in Geneva, he sat silently. He didn't need to speak. His very presence cast a long shadow. Reporters whispered that anyone daring to challenge the foundations of international law would eventually face the cold scalpel of Edward Chen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. A few words, carefully chosen, delivered into the microphone would be enough to dismantle a young president's revolution. The irony was stark. As the son of immigrants, as a man raised on stories of displacement, Chen should have understood the pain of small nations struggling for dignity. Yet his rise through the system had turned him into its perfect defender. He believed law, however unjust its history, was the last wall standing between order and chaos. And if forced to choose, he would guard that wall, even if it silenced voices like Traoré's. When the moderator's gavel struck, Chen placed his pen down and fixed his eyes on the podium. No nod, no smile, just a gaze as steady as stone. Yet in that silence, everyone sensed it. An intellectual confrontation was about to unfold. On one side, the young soldier from Burkina Faso, carrying the cries of his people. On the other, the American judge, carrying centuries of legal authority and the cold confidence of the system. And soon the world would be forced to face a question no courtroom had ever truly answered. Is justice found in the words of law, or in the lived pain of those history has ignored? There are moments when a single sentence freezes an entire room. That was exactly what happened when Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium in Geneva. He didn't rush, he didn't grandstand. He simply adjusted the microphone, paused for a breath, and spoke in a voice low and steady. For 60 years, we have been told to respect international law, to protect foreign investments, and to embrace democratic values imposed from outside. The words cut through the chamber like a blade. Heads turned. African delegates nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing themselves in his defiance. Western representatives stiffened, scribbling frantic notes. With just one opening line, Traoré had shattered the expected script of diplomatic pleasantries. Then, from his breast pocket, he pulled out a small, folded bundle of papers. It was not a polished speech drafted by advisors, but an old mining contract. He held it up with a hand that trembled slightly, though his eyes did not waver. This contract gives a foreign corporation the right to mine Burkina Faso's uranium for 99 years, in exchange for just 5% of its market value. The chamber erupted in whispers. Reporters raised cameras, shutters clicking in rapid bursts. The French delegation stared at their notes, faces taut. In seconds, Traoré had transformed a conference hall into a courtroom, where the entire world was both jury and witness. For those watching from afar, the injustice was staggering. Imagine if Texas signed away its oil for a century, with only a few scraps of profit returning to its people. Would Americans accept that? Of course not. Yet this was the reality Africans had endured for decades. Traoré didn't stop at numbers. He described what those contracts meant in real life. Children studying in classrooms without desks, while gold from their land was stored safely in European banks. Vast cotton fields capable of clothing half a continent, yet families too poor to buy a new shirt for their children. These were not abstractions. They were lived experiences. And they pierced the chamber far more deeply than statistics ever could. Then came the question that no one dared answer. Does the international law you defend so passionately protect the children forced to drink poisoned water from foreign-owned mines? The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke, but the truth hung in the air. For the first time, the debate was no longer about treaties or trade. It was about conscience. His opening gambit revealed a simple truth. Sometimes, to shift the course of history, you don't need grand theories or lofty ideals. You only need facts. Clear, undeniable, and delivered at the right moment. Traoré had found that moment, and he used it to full effect. The chamber could not ignore him. The world watching from afar could not dismiss him. His words forced a question onto every mind. Is justice found in the ink of contracts signed in closed rooms, or in the eyes of children yearning for clean water? But every bold move comes with a price, and that price was about to be demanded, as Edward Chen, the American judge whose reputation made him the sharpest defender of international law, prepared to rise from his seat. The air thickened. Everyone knew the real confrontation was about to begin. As Traoré's words faded into the still air, the chamber in Geneva seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs, the frantic scribbling of journalists, all fell silent when a figure slowly rose from the front rows. Edward Chen. He moved without haste, each step deliberate, like a surgeon preparing for a high-stakes operation. He laid his papers neatly on the desk, adjusted his steel-rimmed glasses, and walked to the podium. The sound of his footsteps carried across the hall, firm and measured, as though each one bore the weight of the international legal system itself. When he stood beneath the lights, the black robe he wore seemed less like clothing and more like a symbol, the embodiment of centuries of Western legal authority. Here was not just a man, but the voice of a system that defined justice by ink on contracts, rather than by memory, pain, or human dignity. "Captain Traoré," he began, his voice calm and precise. The word captain, not president, fell like a calculated slap. Western delegates exchanged fleeting smiles. African representatives stiffened in their seats, insult written on their faces. But Chen continued unfazed, as though he had just placed his opening piece on a chessboard he fully intended to dominate. "International law exists," he said, his tone sharp in its restraint, "to prevent strong men from tearing up contracts whenever they become inconvenient to their political narratives." The sentence sliced through the chamber like surgical steel. He didn't argue with Traoré on morality or statistics. He shifted the ground entirely. Back to the battlefield he knew best, the law. And in that space, Chen was unmatched. Reporters typed furiously. Editors received breaking alerts within seconds. Chen fires back, dismantles Traoré's argument. Cameras zoomed in on his face, unflinching, cold, composed. Then he paused. Slowly, almost ritualistically, he removed his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, and looked directly at Traoré. His next words landed like a hammer. "The road to tyranny, Captain, is always paved with good intentions, and the bodies of contracts discarded by those in power." The silence afterward was electric. The chamber erupted in whispers, Western delegates sighing with relief, while journalists scribbled as though recording a historic verdict. In a single line, Chen had reframed Traoré not as a revolutionary, but as a potential tyrant in the making. He pressed on. "If any nation could rip up agreements at will, international order would collapse, trust in law would disintegrate, and what would replace it? Nothing but chaos." For Western delegates, it was the reassurance they craved. A return to order, stability, predictability, the very things that kept their privileges intact. Chen had taken Traoré's plea for dignity and turned it into a warning of disorder. In that moment, Chen embodied mastery. Like a grand master of chess, he didn't need to attack furiously. A few precise moves were enough to corner his opponent. He didn't raise his voice or pound the table. He simply let his words, sharp and precise, carry the force of law itself. And yet, in his cold logic, a crack had formed. Because in defending international law so ruthlessly, Chen had also reminded everyone what that same law had once legitimized: slavery, colonial conquest, and the theft of entire continents under the guise of legality. He had won the legal round, no question. But had he opened the door for Traoré to fight on another battlefield, one of morality, of memory, of truth too raw to be contained in legal codes? The hall seemed to tremble in its silence. And as Chen stepped back, the eyes of the African Union delegates turned once more to the young soldier in fatigues. Traoré sat motionless, jaw tight, but his gaze glowed with something different, not defeat, but resolve. The legal titan had struck hard, but the fight was far from over. When Edward Chen's words fell silent, the Geneva Hall seemed suspended in a void. Some delegates exhaled in relief, convinced the matter was settled. Journalists raced to type headlines: "U.S. Judge destroys young African leader with a single sentence." Yet at the podium, Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, his hands gripping the wooden stand, his eyes locked on Chen. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the gaze of someone who had just discovered the path to fight back. He began slowly, his voice steady, not angry, not raised. "Your Honor," he said, deliberately using Chen's title. "You speak of contracts and law with the precision of someone who has never watched a child drink poisoned water from a foreign-owned mine. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Delegates leaned forward, pens stilled in midair. The contest had shifted. No longer a battle of legal codes, Traoré was pulling the confrontation onto another battlefield, one where Chen's brilliance offered less protection, the battlefield of morality and lived experience. He pressed on. We were told to respect international law, yet it was that same law which once legitimized the slave trade, that same law that defended colonialism, that same law that declared an entire continent to be empty land waiting for European improvement. The words struck like drumbeats echoing through history. And then he paused, long enough for the silence itself to accuse. It was not the silence of defeat, but the silence that forces reflection, that compels even the most powerful to remember what they prefer to forget. In that pause, the tide shifted. Chen wielded law. Traoré wielded memory. And memory is a weapon no statute can erase. Laws can be rewritten, contracts renegotiated, but the blood and tears spilled across Africa for centuries could not be denied. He told the story of a village in southern Burkina Faso, where a foreign corporation ran a gold mine. The gold left in polished bars for Europe, but the village well stank of metal, its children plagued by skin and lung diseases. In the contracts you defend so eloquently, Traoré asked, whose signature represented those children? The weight of the question lingered. This time, silence was not triumphant, but uneasy. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted. African delegates straightened, pride returning to faces too long bowed. European representatives fidgeted, unease flickering across once confident expressions. Traoré's words were not simply a rebuttal, they were a mirror. And in that mirror, history's shadows could no longer be ignored. He closed with a line that pierced deeper than any legal analysis. Forgive me, Your Honor, if I choose the screams of dying children over the sanctity of contracts signed in the dark. It was not argument, it was indictment. Journalists scribbled furiously, some wiping tears. Hashtags began to spread across social media. Hashtag contracts vs children. Hashtag justice for Africa. The moral battle was spilling beyond the chamber and into the digital bloodstream of the world. Even Chen, stoic as stone, had stopped writing. His pen, ever moving, ever dissecting, lay still. He knew he had been struck by something outside the reach of legal precedent, the raw force of moral truth. This was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It had become a universal question. Is justice defined by ink and contracts, or by the dignity of human lives those contracts ignore? Geneva witnessed a rare moment that day, a duel in which neither side collapsed, but both forced the world to rethink. Chen had the sharper blade of legal authority, but Traoré had seized the higher ground of morality. And in the eyes of the public, morality always carried deeper resonance. When the first applause rose from the African Union section, it spread cautiously, then firmly, through the hall. Not everyone clapped, but everyone understood. History was being written. Traoré drew a deep breath. He knew this was only the beginning, because once he left Geneva, the battlefield would no longer be marble chambers. It would be media headlines, viral clips, and whispers in the corridors of power. And so the fight was far from over. The next battle would not be fought with law or morality alone, but in the war for public trust and global perception. As the applause faded and the Geneva hall emptied, the real battle was only beginning. From that moment on, every word, every image no longer belonged to the four cold walls of the convention center. They had escaped into the roaring stream of global media, where a single edited clip or a headline could tilt the balance of perception. That night in Washington, the glow of giant monitors lit a closed office. Charts of shares, hashtags, and video snippets refreshed by the second. Marcus Kane and Victoria Langston wasted no time. Cut the line where he says, "We cannot stand on our own," and push it online, Victoria instructed. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Stripped of its context, it painted Traoré as though he had confessed weakness. In Ouagadougou, thousands of miles away, old smartphones buzzed in cafes and street corners. The doctored clip spread like wildfire on WhatsApp and Facebook. For many who had never set foot in an international forum, it was bewildering. Did he really say that? Villagers asked one another. A farmer shook his head in frustration. I saw the full speech. He never said it that way. But who will believe us when that clip is all the world sees? This is the nature of the media war. Truth mattered less than what spread faster. In New York, an international news editor received a leaked file, an internal report warning of instability in Burkina Faso. It had not been verified, but by the next morning, the headline was everywhere. Burkina Faso faces internal crisis. Overnight, Traoré's image shifted from courageous leader to embattled president. The West had mastered this playbook. A well-timed leak, a clipped quote, an anonymous source, and the machinery of doubt began to grind. This time, its target was a young African president who had dared to speak too boldly in Geneva. But Traoré did not stay silent. In Burkina Faso, he appeared not in a formal suit behind a polished podium, but in simple clothes, standing in the heart of a crowded marketplace. Around him were real people, mothers, children, elders. They can cut my words, he said, but they cannot cut the smiles of mothers receiving rice in their hands. They cannot cut the look in children's eyes when they open new school books. Those images spread like wildfire. On Twitter, people shared not doctored clips, but pictures of Traoré hugging a child, shaking hands with an old man. These images needed no subtitles. They spoke louder than headlines. Americans often say, seeing is believing. Traoré understood this well. Logic could be twisted, but lived reality had a power no edit could erase. The media battlefield had become something more than a game of Western boardrooms. It was now a head-to-head struggle between lived truth and manufactured truth. A young journalist in Ghana wrote on her blog, "If he loses this war of media, we lose an entire generation. But if he wins, it won't just be for Burkina Faso, it will be for Africa." People began to realize this was no longer just about one country. It was a fight over who gets to tell Africa's story, the people living it, or those outside manipulating it. In the days that followed, two streams of narrative clashed. Western outlets emphasized instability, shortages, and internal divisions. At the same time, clips recorded on ordinary phones, Traoré visiting villages, speaking with children, circulated on social media, each post a quiet act of resistance. It all came down to a question not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire world. In this age, who truly owns the truth? Giant media corporations, or millions of small phones scattered across a continent? One evening, Traoré appeared again, standing in Ouagadougou's central square. No microphones, no stage, just his voice rising over the crowd. "They may say I am weak, but you will prove I am not alone." The response came as a wave of chants and cheers, louder than any broadcast, stronger than any news ticker. The media battle had begun in earnest, and it was no longer a conversation. It was a race between a lived truth that people could see with their own eyes and a constructed truth engineered to erase it. And everyone watching knew where the next showdown would be, the grand international stage where Traoré would once again face powers far greater than himself, not only through law or morality, but through the cold, calculated arena of geopolitics. On the day of the United Nations summit in New York, light rain fell across the city. Motorcades rolled steadily down First Avenue, delivering delegations into the towering glass headquarters. Inside the vast chamber, nearly 200 flags hung in a great circle, each a symbol of sovereignty, each a reminder of the weight of global diplomacy. But the air was different this time. After Geneva, every eye turned toward one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Would the young president of Burkina Faso continue to defy the global order? Or would he be buried beneath the media campaigns and legal precision already deployed against him? In the press gallery, reporters whispered, "If Geneva was the warning shot, New York will be the real battle." Outside, hundreds of African diaspora demonstrators gathered, waving banners and chanting his name. "This is no longer just about Burkina Faso," a Ghanaian woman declared. "He is speaking for all of us." Inside, tension rippled through the hall. Western delegations had already played their hand. Leaked reports of stalled aid and rumors of internal instability had been fed to major outlets. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso faces allegations of aid misuse." The strategy was clear: drown his voice in doubt before he could speak. When his name was called, silence fell. Traoré stepped to the podium, not in elaborate military regalia, but in a simple shirt. And in that simplicity, he stood out all the more among the suits and ties. He did not open with long pleasantries. Instead, the massive screen behind him lit up. A video played, mothers receiving bags of rice in their hands, children smiling with new school books, trucks carrying supplies down dusty roads to distant villages. No commentary, no narration, just reality. The hall fell utterly silent. Numbers could be debated, reports denied, but these images, raw and unfiltered, could not be erased. When the film ended, Traoré leaned into the microphone. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but carried to every corner of the chamber. They can splice my words, but they cannot splice the smiles you have just seen. They can spread anonymous reports, but they cannot erase the truth that those people received food, that those children held their books. Applause erupted first from the African Union section, then spread further. Even journalists known for skepticism looked unsettled, for they too understood. Media can distort, but lived images speak for themselves. He continued, "I am not here to beg for aid. I am here to say it is time to change the way the world tells Africa's story. We are not only recipients, we are communities standing on our feet. And we will not be silent in the face of injustice, whether it comes in the name of international law or diplomatic reports." Delegates from across Africa straightened in their chairs, their faces lit with pride. They knew his words were more than political. They were a collective declaration. In Washington, Marcus Kane watched from a live feed, jaw tightening. His carefully staged narratives had been outflanked. "He's playing straight to the global audience," he muttered. Beside him, Victoria Langston sighed. "We'll need another move. He's winning hearts." That was the essence of this stage. It wasn't only diplomats who mattered. Millions were watching online, their hearts and minds at stake. And Traoré had touched something no legal argument or media report could control: human emotion. The question now was no longer who is right, but who controls the story. When Traoré ended, the chamber rose in applause. Not all approved, but none could deny. He had forced them to listen, and in diplomacy, sometimes being heard is already a victory. As he stepped down from the podium, he knew this was no ending. This was a single victory in a much longer war. For once, the lights dimmed and the cameras turned off. The counterattacks would come, quieter, sharper, more dangerous. But today, in front of the world, he had proven one truth: Africa had a voice, and that voice could no longer be silenced. And as the applause echoed, the story was far from over. Ahead lay the final act, where not only media and law, but the entire balance of global power would be tested. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the podium in New York, the applause still echoed through the hall. Not everyone agreed with him, but everyone understood they had just witnessed a moment that would not be forgotten. A young leader from a small West African nation had made the world listen, and that, in itself, was a victory. But the story didn't end there. As soon as the lights dimmed and the cameras turned off, closed-door meetings began. In Washington, London, Paris, phones buzzed, messages were sent, strategies were drawn. The great powers knew, if this fire spread, it would not just be Burkina Faso rising, but Africa itself demanding sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, people flooded the streets. There were no microphones, no polished stages, just songs, drums, and small flags fluttering in the wind. An old man sat by the roadside, telling his grandson, "Do you see? We are no longer invisible. Our voice has traveled far." That same night, on social media, a photo spread like wildfire. Traoré shaking hands with a smiling boy. The caption was simple: "Dignity cannot be silenced." That image said more than any official report ever could. For many Americans, for many in the West, something became clear. This was not just about one African nation. It raised a universal question. What is justice? Is it found in hundreds of pages of contracts drafted in private rooms? Or is it in the eyes of a child, longing for a clean sip of water? As the saying goes, Silence is the oxygen of control. And that is what Traoré shattered. He refused to stay silent, even knowing the risks: retaliation, sanctions, smear campaigns. But because of that choice, he became more than a president. He became a symbol for Burkina Faso, for Africa, for every community that had ever been told to keep quiet. The lesson is clear. Dignity cannot be borrowed and freedom cannot be handed down. They must be claimed, at the cost of courage. And when a leader dares to pay that price, he no longer fights for himself, but for an entire generation. In the days ahead, Western outlets would continue to publish negative headlines. Politicians would question and criticize. But something had already changed. Millions of ordinary people, from Burkina Faso's villages to New York's crowded streets, had heard that voice. And once people hear the truth, they cannot unhear it. In the quiet of an evening in Ouagadougou, Traoré wrote in his small notebook, "They can block aid, they can splice my words, but they cannot kill the will of a people determined to rise." Perhaps he already knew. The fight would be long, the road full of challenges. But if today had proven anything, it was this: Africa would no longer walk in silence. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest victory. As the screen fades, we are left not only with the image of a young leader standing against giants, but with a simple truth. Words spoken from the heart can shake walls of power that once seemed eternal. And the final question, left for the viewer, for you, for me, is not whether Ibrahim Traoré was right or wrong. The real question is, where will we stand? Will we stay silent, or will we raise our own voices? Because sometimes all it takes is one voice refusing to be silent, and the world begins to change.